Hi, this is Anthony and welcome back to my show. It's been a while since I've done a D.B. Cooper question and answer video, so as the year is winding down, I thought I'd do another one to catch up with some of the comments left on my various videos about the Cooper hijacking case. As I jump right in, remember these are not to try to embarrass people. All of these messages have been left publicly on my videos in the comments section for everyone to see. Here's a longer one, and those are often really juicy because there's a lot of questions and comments contained in them. I'm not going to read this one, but I'll have the full text of it on the screen and you'll have enough time to read it. But a few comments are sparked by it. One, I worked for 8 years in security at a high-tech company. Obviously, we were not the police, we're not the FBI, we were not investigators, but in the course of our job, sometimes we had to investigate incidents that occurred. Unfortunately, the location that I was at was one where very few things were going on, so that was nice. Less headaches for the security employees. But obviously, on occasion, over the course of those 8 years, things would happen, and fortunately, because there were cameras all around, we were able to review the video to see what exactly had happened. That being said, on occasion, things happened that were a 1 in 100 chance of happening. But of course, the 99 out of 100 other times didn't result in an incident, so we didn't really necessarily catch it because there was no reason to review the video. When we're looking at the D.B. Cooper case or any other case, we as armchair investigators need to look at things just as actual investigators do. If we're going to consider a chain of events concerning the Cooper case that perhaps link it to the government somehow, we need to look at how likely that is. If you have a link in the chain that is a 1 in 100 chance of happening, that's certainly possible, although unlikely. But then when the next link that is connected to it is also a 1 in 100 chance, then both of those happening in a connected way is now 1 in 10,000. And then for the next extraordinary link to fall into place, that's another 1 in 100 chance. Then the odds of those three things happening in sequence are now 1 in a million. Again, something like a hole-in-one at a golf course is sometimes considered to be a 1 in a million chance, although you hit that in one stroke, not in three, and you're aiming for the hole, and you have many thousands of people playing golf, weather permitting, so holes in one do occur on a fairly regular basis throughout the world. But when we're talking about government conspiracies, the situation becomes more problematic. Are there government conspiracies? Sure. But what is a conspiracy? When two or more people agree to do something that they're not supposed to do. That could be skimming money from a collection plate at church, or it could be involving an assassination of a national leader. But how do we know about conspiracies? It's because they get investigated and people talk. It's very difficult for people, whether in government or out of government, to keep their mouths shut. The way that the FBI catches members of the mafia is they bug the places that they hang out in and listen to those guys brag about all the crimes they've committed and the ones that they're planning to commit. For those people, and I'm not saying the commenter is one of them, but I've heard from lots of people, and I've addressed it in other Q&A videos, if you believe that the FBI knew who Cooper was and tried to cover it up, then how is it that the relevant people knew, but Himmelsbach and Carr and the other people who have investigated and written books about it never got the memo? How can you have the National Guard and explorer troops and everybody else combing the mountains and woods of southwest Washington looking for Cooper after the hijacking, and none of them find any evidence, but the government sends in a SEAL team to recover Cooper? And I don't know if SEAL teams existed at that time, but certainly there were Green Berets or Rangers that could have fulfilled the mission if it happened, which again, if it's not clear, I don't believe happened. If Cooper was the son of a high-ranking politician or military officer, is that going to get covered up? You have to remember, within a few years prior and after the Cooper hijacking, the FBI was investigating the very top echelons of the government. The vice president, Spiro Agnew, had to resign due to corruption when he was the governor of Maryland. Eventually, President Nixon would resign due to the Watergate cover-up. If the FBI is not going to protect the top two people in the United States government, they're not going to protect the son of some politician who skyjacked an airplane. As far as you mentioning the Kennedy assassination. Well, my friend, that's maybe something that we can talk about at another time. But there's probably 1,000 books and 10,000 hours of audio time devoted to that assassination and any conspiracies that may or may not have been. So that's not something that we can touch upon here, though that's always intriguing. But again, I really do appreciate you taking the time to write and sharing your thoughts. And I appreciate that you point out that you don't necessarily believe that this is what happened, only that it could have happened, despite little or no evidence for it. Okay, let's move to another comment. Again, a great comment. What I've said in some of my videos is that what I love about unsolved cases, and I'm not really interested in cases that you see on Dateline NBC or 48 Hours, where a crime was committed and there is some turns and twists, but eventually a neighbor is identified using DNA as the perpetrator of the murder, and then they get sentenced to prison. There's nothing wrong with shows like that, but there are a million of them, and they're pretty cut and dried, even though sometimes there may be a number of potential suspects who look good as far as being the perpetrator until the ultimate murderer is identified. I like cases like the D.B. Cooper and the Jack the Ripper and the Black Dahlia killer cases because there are so many good suspects and there are so many clues, although we don't often truly know what is a verified fact and what is over time has been accepted as a fact but may be incorrect. And certainly any conclusions drawn from misleading so-called facts are by definition probably going to be misleading or outright inaccurate. But I think the whole reason that people are interested in these cases is that maybe we can move the needle along towards a resolution. Maybe we can find a piece of evidence that actually definitively solves the crime. And as I've pointed out in some of my videos, the case of the Somerton man in Australia is one of those interesting ones where a man is found dead, likely he died of poison. There's all kinds of very mysterious clues and people involved, incredible theories about him possibly being connected to a Soviet espionage ring. Yet in the end, DNA results this year have determined that he was a divorced man with no kids, probably lonely, likely didn't see anything in life living for, and ingested poison and laid back against a seawall on a beach smoking a cigarette and watching the waves as he passed away. So there's an example where the case really has been definitively solved and people in Australia agree to this conclusion. Now, if you read many of the comments to my videos, there's a lot of people who think that the case has been solved by Dan Gryder and the authors of The Real McCoy. These viewers believe that without a doubt the case has been closed and that they also see the supposed parachute that was found as being further evidence. But I have to remind my dear viewers, the case has not been solved by any stretch of the imagination. No mysterious parachute in North Carolina has solved it. 3 titanium alloy particles on a tie has not solved it. But it is a very interesting case, isn't it? But I should caution people interested in the case just because one suspect looks good, just because somebody has made a convincing documentary proposing a particular candidate, does not mean that they did it. When we have a trial in our court system, we have a jury, and the jury, looking at all the evidence presented from both sides, is tasked with making a decision on guilt or innocence. But we all know that juries make mistakes. Innocent people who serve decades in prison for crimes they didn't commit or are exonerated by DNA evidence. And while juries are fallible and not necessarily a perfect system, it's what we have and probably better than an alternate system. But we need to remember that consensus does not equal truth. The consensus used to be that the sun went around the earth. The consensus used to be that some people were witches and should be burned or hanged. The consensus, or the majority, thought that certain people should be enslaved or women should not be able to vote, or a myriad of other things which have changed over time. So just because many people in the Cooper sphere believe in the guilt of one or another suspects, in no way is this case closed at this time. And lastly, you mentioned the case of deathbed confessions. That is exactly how, either directly or indirectly, we have some of the suspects. I've already gone into excruciating detail about the case of Kenny Christensen in a few other videos. I won't go into it here. There are other people who have claimed to be Cooper, basically on their deathbed or shortly prior to their death. They can't all be Cooper, if any of them are. The problem with deathbed confessions, or any type of confessions, is there are a lot of liars out there. For instance, in the Black Dahlia case, I believe that there were initially 60 confessions, all of which were investigated by the police and discounted, and later a total of 500 confessions concerning that crime. If somebody confesses to their wife on their deathbed that they were Cooper and said that there was a footlocker in the garage full of cash, and the wife goes to the garage, finds the money, the serial numbers match those numbers that were released by the FBI, then yeah, that's probably proof that the person was Dan Cooper. But the fact that somebody was obsessed with the Cooper case, the fact that they may have written notes in a library book about the Cooper case, that they may have told their wife that they were D.B. Cooper, but if there's no evidence, then that's not evidence. I know that certain things said on a deathbed, unlike other things, can be used in a court of law, but one needs to use reason with such reports, because for whatever reason, even if somebody claims to be D.B. Cooper on their deathbed, they could still be lying. It's not like a woman is on her deathbed and tells her adult child that she had an affair prior to the child's birth and that the child's biological father may be somebody different than her husband. That's something that somebody may say on their deathbed, and it's probably true because they're not going to lie and say it just to be cruel to say such a thing to their child or even their spouse. So we need to think about, if there is a deathbed confession, does any other evidence corroborate that confession? And usually it doesn't. It's just circumstantial rumor that we don't even know the validity of whether statements and actions were ever even made. Okay, that was a very good comment. Thank you. So here Chris says that if you don't trust Bruce Smith, check out the work done by Jeffrey Gray. I don't believe that I ever mentioned Bruce Smith or really alluded to him or his work other than some of the information that I believe he had about Tina Mucklow, which I found interesting. As far as the quality of information that I've seen by glancing on and off at Bruce Smith's website, which is called the Mountain News, Washington, I've not seen anything about the Cooper case that jumped out at me as being anything but straightforward. So no criticisms or critiques of anything about the Cooper case that I've seen from him as far as what he's written. I have been made aware that Mr. Smith writes about various other topics, including alien abductions and sexual contact between aliens and himself. Here's a few screenshots. I encourage my viewers to make their own decisions on who, including myself, should be considered to be trustworthy sources of information about this and any other topics. Thank you for the suggestion about Jeffrey Gray. Looking at his Wikipedia page, he certainly looks like an intriguing writer. I did find a partial online copy of his Cooper book and glanced at it. Looks very interesting. I think at some point I may try to get my hands on a copy and read it. So thank you for passing on that information. Here's a comment about Richard Floyd McCoy's children. Of course, McCoy is the favorite suspect that comes from the book The Real McCoy and was made very popular recently by 2 documentaries from Dan Gryder. I have to admit, when I saw the first documentary, I was convinced that McCoy was Cooper. The evidence that was provided in the documentary certainly made him look like he had committed the Cooper hijacking, and then about 5.5 months later committed another hijacking, which he eventually was prosecuted and imprisoned for. Some people argue that the 2 cases had many similarities. Basically, the only similarity is the same type of airplane and both skyjackers jumping out of the aft staircase. If you really analyze the 2 videos, especially the second one, you'll see that the producer of them is extremely biased and selective in the information that he provides. I've covered this case in many other videos explaining why I no longer think that McCoy committed the Cooper skyjacking. As far as his children, they were extremely young at the time. His son may have only been about 1 year old at the time of the known skyjacking, which was in 1972. And of course, by 1974, McCoy had escaped from prison and later killed by an FBI agent. McCoy's daughter was a few years older than the son. I'm not going to put a whole lot of credence into anything that a person's children say, much less children who were probably about 1 and 4 years old the last time they saw their father. That is not a very high standard of unbiased evidence. Okay, here's another comment from Chris about the McCoy case. Richard Floyd McCoy was said to be a very kind man by family and friends. I believe this is part of a long-running discussion between Chris and myself about Sheridan Peterson, where I argue that everybody said that Sheridan Peterson was a very kind man and not the kind of man who would skyjack a plane. The only circumstantial evidence for Peterson was that he kind of looked like the drawing of Cooper, and he was a parachutist. Some aspects about Sheridan Peterson's life were a bit murky, but from what is publicly available, it looks like he was a humanitarian that believed in civil rights and eventually was a teacher in California before he passed away. As far as McCoy being a nice man, we all know that there are people who are nice in public and then are jerks or sometimes terrible people in private. Sometimes people that are well respected in the community as politicians or teachers or coaches, but then it turns out that they have a very dark side. Perhaps McCoy was a nice man to many people. I don't dispute that. I don't think that we have any hard evidence that we could take to trial and convince a jury that that's true, but perhaps it is. But it is without a doubt, unquestioned, that he committed the skyjacking in 1972. He threatened people. He waved a gun around. He claimed to have a hand grenade that had the pin pulled out. He was reported to be very agitated. That is not really the behavior of a very kind man. Could he be a kind man in public and a nasty skyjacker? Sure. Again, there is no doubt that he committed the skyjacking over Utah in 1972. Does that mean that he committed the Cooper skyjacking in 1971? No, not at all. And in fact, the behavior of Cooper was said to be generally calm and polite, nearly the exact opposite of McCoy in his known skyjacking. More circumstantial evidence that the two cases are not connected. Again, 50 years after the fact, who are we believing from family and friends that knew McCoy, the skyjacker, and violent felon? What are the names of these friends and family? From his kids, who hardly knew their father and have a reason to potentially be biased? Again, even if what is stated here is true, it doesn't mean that he was D.B. Cooper. Here's a few more comments. I do appreciate people taking the time to write, but I'm not always sure of what point they're trying to make. Here's one that does make sense. It's talking about one of the suspects and their hair. Certainly Cooper's hairline seems to be receding a bit, and it appears that he had somewhat thinning hair. Obviously, if you're familiar with Vince Peterson, who has become a suspect due to the 3 particles of titanium alloy, Peterson in later years had a thick head of hair, though he does look somewhat like Cooper, and again the connection to him has been made through the 3 particles of titanium, although I do not necessarily think that the lab that Vince Peterson worked in was the only one where the material was worked with, and I provide my evidence in a number of other videos that I've done concerning the titanium tie. Please look at those. I think that one has to be open to the possibility that the titanium on the tie left behind could help identify the true identity of Cooper, but the case is certainly not closed in my mind, but good observation. And then here's one last comment. Again, I appreciate people writing. I assume that they think that this conclusion by other researchers is foolish concerning identification of Vince Peterson. Not that my analysis was foolish, although, as I point out, I'm not above making unintentional errors. And that's why I always encourage people who have good information or evidence to the contrary to please point out in the comment section so that if I'm wrong, I can get straightened out on it. Okay, once again, this has gotten far longer than I thought it would be. I'll wrap up now. I do appreciate everyone who's made it this far. I appreciate everyone who watches all of my videos, and I really do appreciate it when people subscribe, like the video, and leave comments. It's now very close to the end of the year. Happy New Year to everybody, and may 2023 be even better than 2022.